The call came in at 6:47 a.m., before the morning shift had fully assembled, before the coffee in the break room had finished brewing, and before anyone at Ridgemont General Hospital in Sudbury, Ontario had any reason to believe that Tuesday would be anything other than ordinary. It wasn't. The patient hit the ambulance bay doors on a stretcher that 2 paramedics were running flat out, one of them pressing a blood-soaked compression dressing against the man's left thigh with both hands and her full body weight, the other calling vitals into the radio that someone at the charge desk was supposed to be recording. Behind them, a black SUV with federal plates had stopped diagonally across the ambulance lane in a way that suggested the driver had not been concerned about parking violations. And, behind the SUV, idling, engine still running, a second vehicle, unmarked, military plates, with 4 men inside who had not yet gotten out, which meant they were waiting for something specific before they moved. The ER charge nurse on duty that morning was a woman named Patricia Hollis, who had been running emergency departments in Northern Ontario for 9 years, and had seen the kind of arrival that rearranged the furniture of a shift without warning. She moved to the bay doors with the clipped authority of someone who had decided how to respond before the doors had finished opening. She never got the chance to use it. Because the man from the second vehicle, the one who had waited while the others rushed in, got out slowly. He was late 40s, built like someone who had spent decades carrying weight in difficult terrain, and he wore the expression of a person who had navigated more chaotic rooms than this one and was not impressed by chaos as a category. He scanned the ER bay in the particular way that saw everything and processed it ahead of any sentence forming. Then he said one word, one name. Not to Hollis, not to the attending physician who had appeared from behind curtain 3 still pulling on his gloves, to the room. Ghost. The room kept moving. Carts rolled. The monitor at Bay 1 beeped its steady rhythm. Someone's radio crackled with something from the floor above. And Nora Callahan, who had been restocking the crash cart at the far end of the bay because that was where they put her, the new one, the quiet one, the one with the gap in her employment file that HR had not asked about because her credentials checked out and her references were excellent, and she had not given anyone reason to look harder. Nora Callahan set down the package of IV tubing she'd been logging and turned around. She had known, in the way you know things you spend considerable energy not thinking about, that this was a possibility. Not this exactly. Not a Tuesday in Sudbury with sleet on the parking lot and the smell of Tim Hortons from the break room down the hall. But the general shape of it, the moment where the thing you'd folded up and put away arrived anyway, carried by people who were very good at finding what they'd been told to find. She walked to the gurney. She had come to Ridgemont General 8 weeks earlier with a duffel bag, a nursing license from British Columbia that was entirely legitimate, and a personnel file that was notable mostly for what wasn't in it. The gaps were careful. The references were real. The credentials were real. The credentials were real. Everything that could be verified was verifiable. Everything that couldn't be was simply absent, which was different from falsified, in which she had learned over the previous 2 years. Most institutions did not have the appetite to question if the rest was clean. The hiring coordinator, a man named Phil who wore a lanyard with 3 separate badge clips and smelled like hand sanitizer and vending machine coffee, had flipped through her file twice and asked her about her break-in employment the way people asked questions they expected not to matter. Took some time, she'd said. Personal reasons. He'd nodded. He hadn't asked which ones. You'll start on supply rotation, he told her. Charge nurse likes new staff to work their way into ER proper, her system. She had translated that pause too. The same pause, different building, different city, same meaning. She has a way of doing things, and new people learn it by doing it her way first. That's fine, Nora said. The charge nurse was Dr. Renata Voss. Not a nurse, technically. She'd crossed from clinical practice into administration 8 years ago and held the charge role with the particular authority of someone who had once been excellent at the bedside and now ran the department through the people who were. She was 53, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of posture that came from deciding a long time ago how she wanted to occupy a room. She was not unkind. That was the first thing Nora had registered about her, because unkindness was the thing she'd been bracing for, and its absence required recalibration. What Renata was, instead, was efficient, And efficiency, Nora had found, could produce its own kind of dismissal. Not personal, not targeted, just structural. The new supply nurse got the supply rotation until she'd proven herself in the department's language. That was the system. The system moved her to the cart. She worked the cart. She was meticulous about it. The attending physician who made her first weeks complicated was Dr. François Beaumont, a second-year resident from Montreal who had the particular confidence of someone who had graduated near the top of his program and had not yet had that certainty meaningfully tested. He was 31, quick, and spoke to the nursing staff the way someone spoke to a search function. Input required, output expected, engagement not necessary. Nora stayed out of his way until she couldn't. The patient was a 62-year-old woman named Mrs. Thibodeau, brought in by her daughter complaining of dizziness and a headache she'd been dismissing for 3 days. Beaumont had ordered the standard workup and was moving through the assessment with the efficient brevity of someone with 6 other patients waiting. Nora was in the bay restocking the procedural supply tray, which put her at exactly the angle to see the monitor that Beaumont was not currently watching. The rhythm was wrong. Not alarmingly wrong, not the kind of wrong that made a monitor alarm go off, but the kind of wrong that you recognized if you'd spent enough time in situations where the monitor was background and the patient was foreground, and you'd learned to cross-reference both simultaneously because the alarm came after the problem, not before. She said his name once, just once. He turned from the chart he was reviewing. The rhythm, she said. Secondary lead, can you check it? The look on his face was the look she recognized. The door closing. The who are you and why are you speaking assessment that took about 2 seconds and returned a result he didn't bother to moderate. She's being monitored, he said. The secondary lead is showing intermittent. Supply rotation doesn't include diagnostic input. He turned back to the chart. Thank you. She looked at Mrs. Thibodeau, who was looking back at her with the expression of a woman who had understood the exchange and found it concerning in the way that patients who'd been dismissed before found it concerning. Nora reached past the procedural tray, which was within her legitimate reach, and adjusted the cable to bring up the secondary lead on the main display where it was impossible to not see. Beaumont saw it. He stood very still for exactly 3 seconds. Then he called for the attending and adjusted the workup, and did not look at Nora again for the rest of the shift. What happened after that was the pattern she knew. Not dramatic. Not written down anywhere. Just the small recalibrations of institutional space that happened when someone decided you were a problem they hadn't anticipated. The supply rotation that kept being renewed. The one time Renata had mentioned to her, not unkindly, that the ER had a structure and the structure needed to run in sequence, and Nora had her full rotation to complete before any expanded role was on the table. The way Beaumont had apparently described her to a colleague in a voice just loud enough to carry, the new one. Doesn't understand scope. She understood scope. She understood it in 4 languages, 2 of them operational, and she had been in rooms where getting scope wrong meant people died. She understood it in ways that would have required a security clearance to explain, which was the problem. So she kept it folded up. She worked her rotation. She restocked the crash cart and logged the supply levels and flagged the items below threshold, and wrote careful notes in the supply system that Renata acknowledged without comment, which was its own kind of message. She ran in the mornings, a route around Ramsey Lake when the weather allowed, and when it didn't, she ran the hospital stairs before her shift and counted it. She had a therapist, Dr. Tersouth, Michael Oseg, who worked out of an office on Elm Street and who had been recommended by a veteran services coordinator who had not asked why she needed the referral. Osei was patient and methodical and did not push faster than she was prepared to move, which was slowly and with considerable detours. They talked around things mostly. The deployments. The particular way her nervous system had stopped distinguishing between types of alert. The 18 months between her last contract in Sudbury that she'd spent in 3 cities doing nothing decisive. What are you looking for? He'd asked once. Quiet, she said. And when you find it? She had thought about that for longer than the question probably warranted. I don't know yet. The morning the federal vehicle pulled into the ambulance bay, she was on her 8th week of supply rotation. Beaumont had been subtly escalating his redirection of her role for 5 of those 8 weeks, and Renata had, without ever framing it this way, been building an administrative structure around those redirections that would make it difficult to challenge without appearing to challenge the department's established process. Not conspiratorial, just institutional. The way institutions absorbed pressure and redistributed it as procedure. She was 3 IV bags into the crash cart restock when the radio crackled. She heard the engine before she understood what it meant. The particular pitch of a vehicle not decelerating the way civilian drivers decelerated when they were looking for a parking spot or following a sign. Lower, more purposeful. The kind of sound that meant someone had chosen this location deliberately and was arriving at the speed the situation required. By the time the stretcher came through the doors, she had already set down the IV bag. The man on it was mid-40s, one hand pressed weakly against the compression dressing on his thigh, the other hanging loose. He was conscious, his eyes were tracking, which was better than a look from outside the bay. But the dressing was saturated through, and the pallor around his mouth had the specific gray quality of someone whose blood pressure was running a losing argument with the rate of blood loss. She was reading the injury before she reached the gurney. Femoral proximity. The dressing had held something, bought time, but the bleed was ongoing, and the time it had bought was not the kind that accumulated indefinitely. Ghost. She had moved to the gurney before she'd consciously decided to. Later, she would not be able to account for the exact sequence. Whether she had heard the name and moved, or moved and then registered the name, or whether both had happened simultaneously in the part of her that had not spent 2 years learning to breathe smaller. The man who had said it was standing at the bay entrance. His name, she would learn in the break room an hour later, was Commander Reed Ashford. She didn't know that yet. She knew the way he'd scanned the room. She knew the quality of stillness in him, the particular economy of movement that came from training and operational experience, and the specific discipline of being in rooms where stillness was functional rather than comfortable. He was looking at her. Recognition without performance. He's got 2, maybe 3 minutes of meaningful perfusion left at this rate, she said. Not to him, to the bay. To whoever in the bay was going to respond like a trauma team. I need a tourniquet above the dressing, 2 large-bore IVs, type and cross, and I need to know what you have for OR availability. Renata appeared from her office doorway, drawn by the radio call that had preceded the arrival. She looked at the gurney. She looked at the soldiers. She looked at Nora, who was already at the gurney, both hands assessing the wound through the dressing in the way you assessed something when what you saw and felt needed to match before the next decision. Drake, Renata started. She still sometimes called her by her first name backwards from a misread on the schedule. It had stuck, "You're not assigned to." Tourniquet, Nora said, not loud but clear. High and tight above the dressing now. He's losing the window. One of the nurses, a man named Garrett. She had not yet learned his last name, but she knew he was competent because she'd watched him work from the periphery for 8 weeks, was already moving. He'd understood what he was seeing before the instruction landed, and the tourniquet was in his hand before she'd finished the sentence. She didn't wait for Renata to complete the sentence she'd started. She worked. In the break room, 40 minutes later with the patient in the OR, and the numbers stabilizing, and the particular decompression that happened after acute crisis when the body submitted its biological invoice. She sat across from Ashford and drank the worst cup of tea she'd had since a forward operating base outside Kandahar, where the water had tasted like the container it had been stored in for 6 months. She told him this. He almost smiled. Almost, the territory of a smile. "We found better tea," he said. "Eventually." "How long have you been looking?" she said. 3 months. She looked at the table. It had the same institutional solidity as every break room table she'd ever sat at in any facility in any city. The particular gravity of furniture that had outlasted the people who'd argued about whose turn it was to clean it. "I covered the file well," she said. "You did." He said it without condescension. "We have resources that don't interact with civilian HR systems. It took 3 months because we wanted to be sure it was you before we moved, not because the trail was clean." "Why now?" "Le point." He said it the way you said names that carried weight. His regular medic was taken off deployment 4 weeks ago. Family medical. He asked for you by name the day he got the notification. Specifically, you. She looked at her tea. Lapointe was the man currently in the OR. She'd known it from the moment she'd seen him on the stretcher. You didn't spend 3 consecutive deployments working alongside someone, and then fail to recognize them when they came through a door bleeding. You knew the hands, the particular way the jaw set when someone was in pain but unwilling to make it everyone's problem. Is going to make it through surgery, she said. The femoral wasn't fully compromised. The bleed was significant, but the tourniquet bought the window. If your OR team is... Dr. Nguyen is already in, Ashford said. She's good. I know. She had watched the surgeon pass through the bay in the way she'd watched everyone pass through the bay for 8 weeks. She had opinions. This was one of them. Ashford put his hands flat on the table, the way people did when they were about to say something they'd been organizing for longer than this conversation. I'm not here to pull you back into anything. You came in 3 vehicles with 4 operators and a priority patient. I came to retrieve Lapointe. A pause. Finding you in the same building was the outcome of information we had before we left Ottawa. The way we came in was because his condition required it, not because we were staging something. He looked at her directly. But you already knew that. She had. She'd been watching the vehicles from the moment the bay doors opened, reading the formation, the entry pattern, the way the operators had positioned, covering the doors but not occupying the room, present without being threatening, the specific calibration of people who knew the difference between securing a space and intimidating a civilian facility. "Two filed," she said. "Renata, Dr. Voss." The correction was gentle. She'd called the administrator on duty before I'd finished introducing myself. Unauthorized intervention. Liability exposure. The usual. He said the usual in the tone of someone who had prepared for the usual. We have body cam footage from entry. Every decision you made is documented. DoD retrieval protocol automatically files with the Civilian Facilities Compliance Office. Someone upstairs watched 40 minutes of footage before Dr. Voss had finished the phone call. She sat with that. She thought about 8 weeks of crash carts and inventory logs and supply notes that nobody acknowledged. She thought about the rhythm on Mrs. Thibodeau's secondary lead that she'd moved into Beaumont Sightline because the alternative was worse. She thought about the particular exhaustion of calibrating yourself smaller than you were, day after day, until you started to forget the original dimensions. Beaumont initiated it, she said. It wasn't a question. Ashford's expression didn't change. His first communication to Voss went out the morning after an incident with a cardiac patient. 3 sentences. The phrase he used was scope uncertainty. She almost laughed. Scope uncertainty. For a woman who had performed emergency thoracic decompression at altitude in conditions where the only light was a headlamp and the only backup was a satellite phone with a 40-second delay. And Voss built the infrastructure around it, she said. She ran with the framework he provided. The supply rotation extensions, the deferred trauma clearance, the pattern of keeping you away from patient-facing cases. He paused. There's a nurse on your floor who kept a record. She looked up. A record. Her name is Sylvie Tremblay, night shift. She'd been documenting the scheduling anomalies for 5 weeks, the disparity between your rotation and nurses with less experience getting trauma floor time. She sent it to the hospital's patient safety officer 2 days ago. He paused. She didn't know we were coming. She just decided she'd seen enough. Nora held that for a moment. Sylvie Tremblay, whom she knew as the nurse who brought her own green tea and always acknowledged her in the hallway when other people had stopped seeing her. Sylvie, who had apparently been watching the Invisible Woman for 5 weeks and keeping a ledger. She could have told me, Nora said. She probably didn't know what you'd do with it, Ashford said. Some people trust the system. She trusted the system. Does the system trust her? The patient safety officer forwarded the report to administration this morning. It arrived at the same time our DoD filing did. He looked at her with the particular attention of someone who chose their next words for precision. The timing was not coordinated. It was just both things being true simultaneously. Dr. Renata Voss did not take the information she was receiving in a way that suggested she would set it down quietly. Nora knew this because the charge desk was not that far from the break room hallway, and Voss's voice carried when she was on the phone with someone she believed was in her corner. You cannot allow a DoD filing to supersede our internal protocol review, Voss was saying, her voice the controlled elevation of someone who had not yet understood that the room had changed shape. I am the department authority. Whatever that woman did in there, she acted outside her. She heard the administrator's response drop Voss's voice down a register. Harder. More careful. Then I want our legal team involved before any staff changes are made. I want her file, complete file, on my desk today. Ashford, who had come to stand in the break room doorway, heard this. Her complete file, he said, requires a clearance level that Dr. Voss does not hold. Nora looked at him. You're telling me that if she files a formal request for documentation, she triggers a review process that goes considerably above a hospital administrator in Sudbury, Ontario. He said it evenly. People who have existing opinions about civilian institutions attempting to sanction decorated field medics, we prepared for this possibility. It was the most likely outcome. She thought about what prepared looked like, the vehicles, the body cam footage that had been transmitted before any of this conversation, the DoD filing that had arrived simultaneously with Sylvie Tremblay's patient safety report. Not a coincidence. An architecture. Someone had built the conditions under which this particular morning would not result in her nursing license being questioned by a charge nurse who didn't know what was in the redacted portion of her file. You knew she'd escalate, Nora said. People who've held unquestioned authority for 8 years escalate when the authority is questioned, Ashford said. It's predictable, so we built for it. Down the hall, a door closed. Then Renata Voss's voice again, lower now, the elevation gone and something harder taking its place. Not anger. Decision. I want to speak with the administrator directly, not email, in person, before end of shift. Ashford looked at Nora. Lapointe's asking about you. He's out of surgery? He is. Nguyen says clean margins, no vascular compromise. He paused. First thing he said when he came around was your name. The nurses didn't know what to do with that. She almost smiled. Of course it was. She stopped by the recovery room on her way to wherever this day was going to take her next. Lapointe was diminished by the horizontal and the monitoring equipment in the post-anesthetic pallor, which was saying something because Lapointe diminished was still a substantial human being. His eyes tracked her when she came through the door. Clear. Good sign. You look different, he said. His voice was dragged up from somewhere below the surface. I work in a hospital. You work in a supply room. He said it with the texture of someone who found this genuinely perplexing. Supply room is part of the hospital. Nora. He said her actual name with the care of a person handling something they understood to be fragile. I was on that bird for 40 minutes. I know. I was thinking the whole time. He stopped. Reorganized. The sentence was too long for where he was. I was thinking about where you probably were. What you were probably doing. And then they told me and I. He closed his eyes for a moment. A supply room. It's where they put me. You let them put you there. She had no answer for that. That was both true and short enough for a man who'd had thoracic surgery 4 hours ago. So she sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at the monitors and let the sounds of the recovery ward arrange themselves around the silence between them. You saved my life, he said finally. And Wayne saved your life. I bought you the time to get to the table. That's the same thing. It's not, but I'll take it. He opened his eyes. You're not going back to the supply room. That's not your decision. No, he agreed, but something happened today that might make it someone else's. The something else arrived at 2:15 in the afternoon, in the form of a woman who walked into Ridgemont General without calling ahead. and whose name, Nora learned from Ashford when she saw the look on his face, was Inspector Myriel Fontaine from the Office of the Inspector General, Canadian Armed Forces. She had a briefcase and a lanyard that identified her and the specific energy of someone who had not come to ask questions so much as to receive answers to questions she had already formed. She found Nora at the crash cart because Nora had gone back to the crash cart after the recovery room because the cart still needed restocking and the discipline of it steadied her hands while everything else in the building was trying to decide what shape to take. Nurse Callahan, Fontaine said. Inspector. I'd like to find somewhere to sit. They sat in the same break room with the same institutional table, and Fontaine put a tablet on it with a file already open. Scheduling database. 8 weeks of supply rotation assignments. Highlighted. Cross-referenced against trauma floor coverage. The disparity was visual, immediate, and damning in the specific way that data was damning when it didn't require interpretation to understand. On its own, Fontaine said, scheduling disparities have explanations. What's not explainable is this. She swiped to the next screen. The email chain. Beaumont's first message to Voss had been sent 48 hours after the Thibodeau incident. It was 4 sentences and contained the phrases professional liability and containment option in a way that were not ambiguous about their intent. Voss's response had been longer and more specific. It outlined how the supply rotation could be extended without triggering a formal HR review. There were 6 exchanges. The most recent was from 3 weeks ago. Nora read them in the time it took the refrigerator in the corner to cycle through its motor hum and back to quiet. Beaumont initiated it, she said, because I corrected him. Yes, Fontaine said, and this is not the first time. She turned the tablet again. A complaint record. Not from Ridgemont. From a hospital in Edmonton filed 22 months ago. A surgical nurse named Diane Beaulieu. The specifics were different. Wrong site risk during prep, correction made, correction resented, but the shape was the same. Systematic redirection, progressive isolation, eventual forced resignation. Beaulieu had left nursing. Her license was current and inactive. She's prepared a statement, Fontaine said. She's been waiting for someone to ask. Nora set the tablet down. She was thinking about Diane Beaulieu in Edmonton, who had corrected a preparation error, a patient safety intervention, unambiguously correct, and spent 6 months being systematically reduced until she decided the job wasn't survivable. A woman whose name Nora had not known this morning and would not forget. What happens to him, she said. He's been suspended pending full review. The hospital's credentialing committee has called an emergency meeting, and the Alberta College of Physicians has received a referral to reopen the Beaulieu matter. Fontaine said it with the flatness of someone who'd filed enough referrals to know they were the beginning of a long process, not the end of one. It will take time. But it's open. It's open, Fontaine confirmed, and Beaulieu knows. Voss's administrative leave was announced in the late afternoon, in the same careful procedural language that institutions used when they were trying to frame the departure of someone central to their operation, in a way that left room for all outcomes. Paid. Pending review. No additional detail. The staff meeting was at 5. The chief of medicine, a man named Dr. Arthur McKay, who had the air of someone who had been having an extremely long and difficult day and was committed to finishing it correctly, stood at the front of the conference room and used process language to describe things that did not require process language. The 2 chairs that were empty were louder than most of what he said. Halfway through, he looked directly at Nora. The assignment structure for Nurse Callahan over the past 8 weeks did not reflect her qualifications. That's a failure of oversight at multiple levels, including mine. I want to say that clearly and in front of this department. She looked at the table. Sylvie Tremblay, 3 chairs down, exhaled audibly and then pressed her lips together as though she hadn't intended to make the sound out loud. Nora did not say anything. The morning had said it already. She found Sylvie in the hallway after. Sylvie was carrying her coat and her bag with the measured efficiency of someone who had gotten to the end of a long shift and was going to drive home and allow herself to feel things in a controlled environment. You kept records, Nora said. For 5 weeks. Sylvie stopped. She had the particular composure of someone who had made a decision they were still deciding whether to be nervous about. I almost didn't send them. I kept thinking it wasn't my place. It was exactly your place. I didn't know what you'd done before. I didn't know any of it. I just knew what I was seeing. She looked at the floor for a moment. The scheduling. The way people stopped directing questions to you. The way you stopped expecting them to. She looked up. That last part is what made me decide. Nora looked at her. You'd started to disappear, Sylvie said quietly. Not all the way, but in the direction of it. And I thought. She stopped. Reorganized. I thought that was wrong. Whatever the reason for it, that was wrong. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 8 weeks, maybe longer. Thank you, Nora said. Sylvie nodded once and kept walking. Lapointe was discharged 3 days later. He walked out slowly, with the care of someone whose body had recently expressed strong opinions about what it would and would not tolerate. And he shook Dr. Nguyen's hand in the corridor with the gravity of a man who understood what a surgeon's hands had given back to him. Nguyen, who was small and efficient and had the posture of someone who had stopped being impressed by difficult cases sometime in her 2nd year of surgical residency, looked at him and then looked at Nora with the expression of someone cataloging information. You're on trauma now? She said. Starting Monday. The nod of someone filing something under correct. Good. Then she was gone. Back to the elevator, back to the OR. Ashford found her in the corridor while Lapointe's team was getting him ready for transport. He was holding something. She recognized it before she understood what she was feeling about it. The unit patch. Worn at one corner, the fabric softened from handling in the particular way of things that had been taken out and put away more than once. Lapointe wanted to give it himself, Ashford said. His surgeon has opinions about what he's allowed to do with his left arm. She took it from his palm. It was lighter than it looked. It always had been. I'm still a nurse, she said. That's what I am. That's what I'm going to keep doing. Ashford waited. But I'll take this, she said, because it's true. Both things can be true at the same time. She put the patch in her scrub pocket. We'll be in touch, Ashford said. Not to pull you back, just in touch. I know, she said. Lapointe, from the wheelchair where his team had finally succeeded in placing him, said her name. She looked at him. Monday, he said. Trauma floor. Don't be late. Deployment didn't make you funny, she said. That's still not funny. His expression, which could generously be described as almost a smile, suggested he disagreed. She watched them go. The corridor settled back into ordinary after the elevator closed. She stood in it for a moment with her hand against the pocket where the patch was, and then she turned and walked back toward the ER. The formal commendation arrived 5 weeks later. It was addressed to Nora Callahan, RN, and cited her role in preserving the life of a priority personnel asset under time-critical conditions in a civilian medical facility. It had been CC'd to Ridgemont General's administration and to the College of Nurses of Ontario, and Dr. McKay had done something with it that she discovered when she arrived for her Monday trauma shift and found it framed on the wall near the charge desk. Plain frame. Wood. Inoffensive. She stood in front of it for longer than she'd intended. Sylvie appeared at her elbow. Mackay asked the department. Everyone said yes. Everyone? Everyone currently in the department. A pause that named 2 absences without using their names. It was unanimous. Nora looked at the commendation. Her name, an official type, on the wall of the department where she'd been logging IV bags and counting suture kits for 8 weeks. She thought about the 2 years she'd spent building a life at the smallest possible scale. The apartment in 3 different cities. The morning runs that were the one constant. The careful, deliberate practice of taking up only as much space as she needed and no more. She understood why she'd done it. She didn't regret it exactly. She'd needed the quiet, the way you needed something that let you figure out what was still intact after the part that had broken. But she also understood, standing in front of her own name on the wall of the department that had tried to make her invisible, that invisibility was only shelter if you intended to leave it. If you stayed, it became something else, something you built yourself, without anyone's help, neat and private and entirely your own, and just as effective at keeping you from the work you were meant to do. She had walked out from behind the crash cart. She hadn't planned it. She'd heard a word. Her word. The one she'd stopped using. And her body had moved before the decision formed, but the decision had been forming for 2 years, quietly, in the space between runs around Ramsey Lake and sessions in Osei's office. And every morning she'd arrived at the supply cart and done the job correctly even when no one was watching. Especially then. That was what no one had understood and could not take away. She had shown up every shift with the full weight of her attention for a job they'd told her didn't need it. And it had mattered anyway. The flagged supply levels, the corrected rhythm on Mrs. Thibodeau's monitor, the 8 weeks of quiet competence that Sylvie had been watching and writing down. She touched the frame, once, briefly. Then she turned to find the chart for patient 1. The ER was already loud. The monitors, the overhead page, the rolling carts, Sylvie talking fast to a paramedic in the bay, Garrett making his good coffee with the grounds he brought from home. The steady particular noise of a department that had its routines and intended to keep them. She picked up the chart. 57-year-old woman, shortness of breath, history of COP D, presenting for the 3rd time this month. She walked to the curtain. She pulled it aside. The woman inside looked up with the expression of someone who had been here before and wasn't sure this time would be different from the other times. Nora looked back at her with the complete, undivided attention of someone who had nothing to prove and nowhere else to be. "Tell me what's been happening," she said. And she listened. "I keep thinking about the crash cart. Not the moment LaPointe came through the doors, not the tourniquet, or the federal vehicles, or the name they called across the bay that stopped me mid-inventory. I keep thinking about the 8 weeks before all of that. The mornings I arrived early, logged the supply levels nobody asked me to log carefully, flagged the discrepancies nobody acknowledged, and went home to an apartment I hadn't fully unpacked yet. I keep thinking about how I did all of it correctly, every shift for a job they designed to keep me small. What I've come to understand is that there's a kind of integrity that doesn't require an audience. It doesn't perform for the people in the room. It just does the work, whether or not the work is being seen, whether or not anyone in a position of authority has decided to notice. Nora didn't stop paying attention because Beaumont dismissed her. She didn't stop flagging the rhythm on Mrs. Thibodeau's monitor because Renata kept extending the supply rotation. She showed up with her full self every day for 8 weeks in a role that was meant to drain it out of her. That's not stubbornness. That's something quieter and harder. The kind of character that holds its shape even when the environment is designed to compress it. I think about Sylvie, too. She watched for 5 weeks and wrote things down and said nothing to Nora directly. Not because she was indifferent, but because she was deciding how to act on what she knew in a way that would actually matter. That takes a different kind of strength. The strength to sit with uncomfortable knowledge and not discharge it impulsively. To wait for the moment when action would land with the weight it deserved. She trusted a process. She believed that putting the truth somewhere official would do something real. And it did. Not immediately, not dramatically, but it did. And then there's Diane Beaulieu, who I hadn't heard of before this story and won't forget. She corrected a preparation error because a patient's safety required it. She was right. She was punished for being right. And she spent 6 months being systematically reduced before she decided the cost was more than she could keep paying. Her license has been current and inactive ever since. I don't know what she's doing now. I hope she finds out what was reopened. I hope it means something to her that someone finally looked, because what happened to her wasn't invisible. It was just unrecorded, and there's a difference. What this story says to me, sitting with it, is that consequences are real even when they're slow. Beaumont's second attempt at the same campaign didn't work differently because Nora was more aggressive or more visible. It worked differently because the conditions he hadn't accounted for, Sylvie's records, the DOD filing, Ashford's preparation, Fontaine's arrival, existed. He hadn't thought about what he couldn't see. That's usually how it goes. The things we fail to account for aren't the obvious ones, they're the quiet ones. The nurse keeping notes on the night shift. The document someone sent from a different province. The person who has been watching and has not yet decided to speak. The smarter you are, the more important it is to stay honest. Not just externally honest. Honest about what you're actually doing and why. Beaumont wasn't unintelligent. He was intelligent enough to build a system. He just wasn't honest enough with himself to recognize that the system he was building was designed to protect his ego rather than his patience. That's where the thinking went wrong. Intelligence without integrity doesn't stay useful very long. Eventually, it turns on itself. Nora carried something for 2 years that most people in her position would have either discharged too early or buried permanently. She found the middle, a life small enough to be survivable, honest enough to keep her in it. And when the moment came, she walked out from behind the crash cart, not because she'd healed completely, not because she'd resolved everything, because someone needed her and her body knew the answer before her mind had finished the question. I think that's what resilience actually looks like. Not the version where you never go quiet. The version where the quiet is a season, not an ending.